as you know, our final speaker for the day is Mary Evelyn Tucker, a dear friend and mentor of mine. And I'm so glad and honored that she comes to join us every spring, and then attracts all her friends and fans to come and be part of this conversation. As you know, Mary Evelyn Tucker is the co-director and co-founder with John Grimm of the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale. Together, she and John organized 10 conferences on the world religions and ecology at Harvard in the late 90s. And then they were series editors of the 10 resulting volumes. And I picked up one of those volumes in the late 90s. It was called Buddhism and Ecology. I was working not far from here in a nonprofit organization, wondering what to do with my life. And I like Devin just said, or Steve maybe, that maybe the universe put that book in my hand, you know? And I was like, Buddhism and Ecology, that sounds totally cool. And started reading it and started thinking, maybe there's something to do here. So I'm extremely grateful for that gift from the universe and that gift from Mary Evelyn and Duncan Williams, who edited that volume. I think of Mary Evelyn as a catalyst or an enzyme that like makes things happen. You know, these conferences, these books, these films, these connections between people, because as you know, not only is she a brilliant scholar and writer, but she's a warm, generous, kind person who brings people together. And that's definitely as important as anything else. And she and John had the good foresight to study with Thomas Berry and learn so much from him, so that now they've co-written this book, Thomas Berry, a biography, which is what we're here today to celebrate. And I was completely thrilled last year when Mary Evelyn said they were working on this book and maybe they could bring it forth at the Religion and Ecology Summit and share it with you all. And I thought, wow, it's so fantastic. So together, Mary Evelyn and John are Berry's literary executors, and they're co-directors of the Thomas Berry Foundation, and they have this amazing new biography out. So let's welcome Mary Evelyn.
So this is a very special day for us in terms of Thomas Berry and this biography. You know, we spent many years working on his books, getting those out, getting them edited, and so on. But this challenge of his books was quite putting the books into life, his life, and putting that context together was something that I'll share with you a little bit, some of the challenges and so on. But I'm also aware that last night, W.S. Merwin passed away, one of the really extraordinary poets. We've lost Mary Oliver and now Merwin, and Ralph Metzer also yesterday. So I want to bring in a sense of the ancestors, you know, who are still with us. We've talked about ancestors of place, Native peoples, but these are some of the ancestors of the movement and of where we're going. So I just want to read one short poem in relation to the music playing on somebody's cell phone. And it's called Any Time. And I have to say, we visited Merwin on his incredible palm plantation in Maui and Hawaii. And it was one of the most extraordinary moments in my life, a visit with this very, very special person who understood these things that we're talking about. So here's this poem of W.S. Merwin. How long ago the day is when at last I look at it with the time it has taken to be there, still in it, now in the transparent light, with the flight in the voices, the beginnings in the leaves, everything I remember, and before it, before me, present at the speed of light in the distance that I am, who keep reaching out to it, seeing all the time faster, where it has never stirred from, before there is anything, the darkness thinking the light. The great flaring forth. And the great flaring forth in our lifetime, I think, began with this extraordinary man. And people have shared their stories and many more stories to come. But I wanted to begin by sharing the story of how I met Thomas Berry. So I came out of the 60s, went to college where Nancy Pelosi went in Washington, D.C. She was ahead of me because I'm still young. And but we were all involved in civil rights, the anti-Vietnam War, and so on. And I worked in Muskie's office, and then I worked for McGovern in the second Nixon election. And after Nixon was elected the second time, and we knew everything was happening in terms of Watergate, and he was tapping our phones in the McGovern campaign. And when he was elected, I said, I'm leaving the country. I'm not coming back until he's out of office. And I went to Japan, and that truly changed my life for many reasons, because of Asian studies and so on. But in particular, and I finally got back to the States when a year and a half later, I came out of a Zen meditation week-long thing, and the headline said, Nixon resigns. And then I began my finishing tour through Asia. But I was particularly moved by receiving before I went from one of the greatest Asian scholars and very good friend of Thomas, William Theodore DeBerry, Ted DeBerry. And they had a friendship of almost 70 years, because both of them died at 94, Ted DeBerry just last year. And I went to him, DeBerry, because he was a student of my grandfather's at Columbia in history. And I said, I'd like to have your copy of your book on Buddhism and these Asian religions. Well, his wife, Fanny DeBerry, said, no, you should have Thomas Berry's Riverdale Papers. And so Fanny DeBerry and Ted were very, very close friends with Thomas Berry. In fact, Ted DeBerry and Thomas went to China in 48, 49. That's how old his interest was in Asia. So I took these papers, these Riverdale papers, unpublished, just mimeographed, and so on. I went to Japan. I read a few before I left, and I was like, these are interesting. These are really interesting. And then I got to Japan. I was like, these are amazing. Amazing. And especially because of this feeling in Japan of Buddhism and Shinto and these different traditions and his sensibility toward them, the opening to the cosmos that those traditions hold, and also one of the most incredible balanced sensibilities. The West gives us this, Asia gives us that. And so it wasn't just, the West is terrible in his understanding, his historical understanding, but he had this balance. The West has time and energy and evolution and an understanding of evolution. Asia has a sense of interiority, of space, and so on. So he had these amazing metaphors to bring these traditions alive. So I came back. I went to Riverdale. My mother was really sweet. We did this dry run to make sure I wouldn't get lost. Getting from our home, my family home was about 20 minutes away. And I get there the next day all prepped and had my little duds on. I remember everything that I was wearing. I get inside this beautiful Riverdale Center on the Hudson River with this amazing red oak, 400-year-old red oak. The light is coming pouring off the Palisades in this beautiful sunroom. He comes forward in his corduroy coat, brown corduroy coat. We meet. That was my teacher. No question. I can remember everything of that day, and for the next 35, 40 years for John, we worked with him. We were his students. He married us, and then we did this biography. This has been one of the most joyful paths of my life, and every day I give thanks for meeting a person like Thomas and meeting incredible companions on this journey with Brian and so many of you in this room. So how can one capture in one book what you've heard from so many speakers, erudition, compassion, warmth, dignity, calmness, serenity, joy. Well, so first, I want to just bring you inside this Riverdale Center where he lived for 25 years, because that center represents all of these gifts that he gave us. It was a center that he envisioned for a long time, and his author said, okay, we'll renovate this house, this old Victorian house, and he moved in there and the walls were filled with books, 10,000 plus books. You come in the main area, the hall in the main area, and here's the beginnings of his understanding of ecology and evolution. But you come into the main room, and there, sitting actually looking at each other, are the Chinese classics and the Indian classics. And over here are the Greek fathers and Greek philosophers in the original languages. Unbelievable erudition. Unbelievable. So that room was a room where we had many, many meetings, which I'll describe in a few moments. But you come to the next room, and you have the arts of Asia just exploding, and all the texts in translation, the Chinese texts, these great classics and so on, the Indian texts, the Buddhist texts. And that is what he was imparting in the Fordham classes, in this astonishing program that he put together in History of Religions. You go upstairs, and here's the indigenous room of native peoples. This was before people were even thinking about what they had to teach us. And he was teaching classes at Fordham and at Barnard in indigenous traditions. So the scope of his learning is so staggering. Let me just give you a glimpse, because it was this pulsation between Riverdale Center as a place of meeting, of congregating, of thinking and reflecting. And then it was Fordham, where he taught. And it was really just about 12 years he was teaching. It was another 12 years. He lived at Riverdale for 25 years. That heartbeat of community and university was incredible, because he navigated it with such skill, with such diplomacy. So at Fordham, he created this History of Religions program that no other university has to this day, including Yale and Harvard and Columbia and so on. And certainly no other Catholic university could even imagine it. Now, why? Because Robert made the good point, between theology and history of religions, there's a huge gap. So he was invited there after he and 20 others were dismissed at St. John's University, very Catholic diocesan university. And they were just asking for the basic things of tenure and free speech. That's the world he came out of, a very conservative, you see, world of a diocesan university like St. John's. So he's whisked off to Fordham. He created, from 1968 to 79, the most astonishing series of courses. He mentored 25 PhDs. It's unbelievable in such different subjects, from indigenous to Chinese to Indian and so on. People came from Yale and Columbia giving up fellowships there to study with him. That's how engaging these classes were. And I remember distinctly him reading Du Fu in a class on the Chinese poets and thinkers. I am weeping because of his understanding of these figures who were dim in American consciousness, even dim in the academy. You see, I went to Japan with no preparation of what is Asia, what's Japan, and still we do not have sufficient understandings of 2/3 of the world's people, which happen to be Asian, which happen to be changing the world right now, China and India in particular. So what I want to say is the scope of his learning in that library, the scope of his teaching at Fordham. The energy that he had was indescribable. And yet, as Drew did so beautifully, in this very almost laconic, laid-back way, and this profundity would come rolling out. So the struggle of his life and the struggle to capture some of this in the book is he was really coming out, living through a medieval period consciousness in his order, a religious order that Matt would know well, and so on. But it was medieval understanding. And if you see the pictures in this book of the robes they're wearing, the rigid, rigid schedule, because he is not just a priest, he's a monk, getting up in the early morning to do the chanting of the divine office, as they called it. And he would get up, come back, and read for 3 hours from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock. But everything was regulated. You couldn't talk, not at meals or whatever, just 1 hour at recreation. You go to some of these places and it still has that dripping with medieval sensibilities. It's unbelievable. So when you think of coming out of the decision to enter a monastery, because he felt, he has this great line, he needed silence. He needed a place to reflect. So he said, it's either the monastery or prison. And he went there because he knew he had to read and he knew he had to understand, and he did. So we're talking about between tradition, modernity, and tradition, medieval and modern. His order, as Joe Mitchell can testify, his order had no idea. It wasn't their fault, but they had no idea what he was about. So he's living in this monastic community. You know, once a day you go in and sit after dinner, and it's called recreation. But he mostly went back to his room to read. So that kind of struggle and drive, because we all crave community, we all crave friendship and intellectual partners. And that's why those years at Fordham nourished him in such amazing ways. The year before we got married, my husband, John Grimm, and a few others lived with him, Brian Brown, at this Riverdale Center, and he called it his golden year. And it was amazing. And I wish John was here, but he's with my brother's skiing right now. But John describes it, and I would be there not every day, but the lunch would go from 12 to 3, when they'd talk about their dissertation, they'd talk about intellectual ideas, and then they'd gather again at dinner, and it would go till 9. This was like the rich, common sensibilities of a care for the studies, but the earth and its future, and what was going to be happening. So to continue that, we created a 12-year sequence of lectures around Teilhard, who hasn't been mentioned sufficiently today, right? So these were the Teilhard lecture series. They went through the academic year once a month, September to June, and so on. And so the first Saturday, we'd gather, we'd fix the chairs, and Thomas, he would always do the November one because it was his birthday, and we'd celebrate his birthday. And we had amazing speakers ranging from all over the world, people who were keenly interested in his ideas. But it was very important, you see, to build around a figure like that, community where he had dialogue partners. And that was one of the most sustaining things of all of our lives, actually, those Riverdale years and those Riverdale communities. And that, when I went into the archives at Harvard, where his boxes of manuscripts and letters are contained, there are probably 40 plus boxes, not all of them by any means yet, curated. But what was so striking were the letters. Before emails, people wrote letters, and it was great. His correspondence around the world was stunning. Now I'm going to go back to the religions, right? Let's just think of this. He goes to China in 48, extremely poor country, in the middle of a civil war with Mao. He goes to Beijing, and Mao and the troops move into Beijing. Literally 6 months after he comes there, he's got to be evacuated. Okay, he's 48. It's hard to imagine. There's a picture in there of the poverty, and he describes his moving through these cities at that time and the children who are orphans of wartime and so on. So he's dealing with a culture that very, very difficult to understand. He meets Ted DeBerry, this great scholar of Asia from Columbia. They become lifelong friends, and they begin to set up Asian studies in the West. No Asian studies until the post-World War II period. So out of that conflict with Japan and other parts of Asia who were not even in our consciousness, this came forward. And Thomas and Ted DeBerry really led that. So what I want to say as well about history of religions and what he did, because many people know and been beautifully stated, you know, the new story and universe story and journey of the journey of the universe. But I want to just say his understanding and teaching for 25 years of the history of world religions is an essential basis of the spirituality. And yes, he affirmed, and yes, he had this celebratory sensibility of these traditions. But why? Because they weren't understood. There were no translations, you see. So let me just illustrate this. In 1962, the Second Vatican Council emerges. We've got Pope John opening the doors, fresh air, just like, fortunately, Francis opening the doors, encyclical. And so John the 23rd and the council says, for the first time in this 2,000-year history, there's truth in other religions. Isn't that something, though? You see, that's our lifetime. I like this. It's our lifetime, you know? He said, because the document says there's light in other tradition. He said there are floods of light in these traditions. You see? I mean, people in the Catholic Church grew up not even really going into Protestant churches, and then Jewish-Christian relations. My grandfather started the National Council of Christian and Jews. You know, that was like, we have come a long way. It's partly what I'm saying here. And to understand history is really critical. Thomas was deeply influenced as well. And I just want to thread this little intellectual piece in. So you've got Riverdale Center, you've got Fordham, you've got Columbia, where he also taught, because that's where DeBerry was. So here's a piece, I think, of hope in relation to his life story. My grandfather was a historian of Europe, and he tried to get Columbia to understand American history was insufficient to understand the world. You've got to understand Europe as well. And by the way, most departments are still very American-centered, right? So, and that came out of my grandfather's study of the Second World War and saying nationalism, he helped found that field. Nationalism's a religion, was his last book. He taught DeBerry. DeBerry went to Asia because he was trained in the Army and Navy language schools, and he and a whole generation who were trained in the Pacific War came back with such respect for Asia, Japan, etc., that they founded these Asian studies. We now have, and thanks to people in this room and so on, so we have a movement from American history, European history, Asian history. I studied world history and taught that. We now have what's called big history. We've got the universe story. That is just from my grandfather's period to now, that's amazing, you see? So on the one hand, we've got this explosion of understanding of world religions that Thomas was at the very beginning. And then we have that he had the sensibilities to say, well, we don't need to only to know just about world cultures and religions and that history. We've got to embed it in the history of the earth, in the history of the cosmos and the universe. What a lineage, you see? the continual learning that he did, that's represented in that library at Riverdale, and bringing in people from all over and studying. He and Brian taking 10 years to write Universe Story, because Brian's studying the science, Thomas is bringing in all this history. What a fusion to tell that for the first time in book form, the Universe Story. We spent 10 years also on Journey of the Universe, and what I want to bring back in is this functional cosmology. Devin's referred to it, Drew referred to it, and so on. So from world history, Earth history, universe history, he was saying continually, this has to be a functional cosmology. It has to relate to the great work of our time, right? The great work. And that great work, as he began, in his 80th birthday, he got up, and Brian was there, and many, many people at this wonderful ceremony after the Cathedral of St. John the Divine honored him. And he got up and he said, we've got to concentrate on the great work, how to bring this out. And he was friends with all of these people, David Orr and Green Buildings on campuses, and John and Nancy Todd and new technologies for water and so on. Miriam McGillis doing agriculture and Genesis Farm. He kept bringing people into the story on the ground, the new story as activated in communities, living communities, the educational work done by the Foundation for Global Community and so on, many of the things that Edie helped support through the Compton Foundation. So that ongoing legacy, I just want to bring in why we feel so grateful for this community, and to say that our offering in terms of Journey of the Universe is to that great work. I'm ending sort of with this and then a song, but not that I'm not going to sing. But I do feel this sense of a continuity of hope with this expanding understanding of where we come from. And so Journey is offered into that space. It's a film, as you know. I'm sure you've seen it. We were so fortunate to get it on PBS. This is the universe working. For 3 years, something on evolution with a spiritual tinge. It's almost, unbelievable, thanks to KQED right here in San Francisco, and then on all the other stations. Again, even for it to win an Emmy here in Northern California, and some of you, like Betty, were at that event, it's a blessing, you see, on the notion that this story is emerging from a community of people, and why the Bay Area has been so important for it. And the book is such, it's a little offering with, I think, of course, depth, because what we were trying to do was take a scientific idea, give it a metaphor, like the balloon and the expansion, so that we can take it in, right? And then give it a sense of meaning. What does this mean? The expansion of the universe, this is so remarkable, right? So it's scientific idea, metaphor, and meaning. That book has been translated into most European languages, Turkish, Chinese, Korean. We have a wonderful visitor, Professor Kim from Seoul National University, about to start the Thomas Berry Society on May 1st in Seoul. So that sense that this is moving out into many parts of the world. And then our dean at Yale said, well, why don't you put these on online classes? And Coursera here on the West Coast and Yale have a Yale Coursera thing. So we have Journey of the Universe film. We've got these conversations which illustrate from scientists saying, well, what's the story here of plate tectonics and so on, each phase of this. But then there's 10 with environmentalists, again, many from the Bay Area. Penny Livingston doing permaculture, Richard Register doing eco-cities, Richard Norgard doing eco-economics, and so on. Our students love this because they can see this is already happening, and very creative people are imbibing and creating in relation to the creativity of the universe. So it's great story, great work. I like to say inspiration and perspiration, if you will. You see. So those online classes, there's 24,000 people watching them. And what we're trying to do is just keep lifting that out into these kinds of spaces. So I think what's happening now, and this is, again, the invitation for each one of your contributions. Some people are retired. They're ready to contribute. Some people are in midlife looking for something new. Younger people like Devin are just fired up. And we are so grateful for this intergenerational handshake with young people. Our students at Yale last spring, we were doing Journey of the Universe. They're in my office weeping because they said, this has re-empowered us. This has given us a new sense of hope and possibility to do the work. Devin worked with them on social media and so on. The next generation is longing for this sense of media. And so what's exploding, and that's what I'm going to share with you, is the arts around Journey of the Universe. All of this dedicated to Teilhard and Thomas Berry. Teilhard with this tremendous sense of an evolutionary story and of evolution, and Thomas taking it into story. So we have Sam and Paula Guarnaccio have done an oratorio celebrating Journey of the Universe. An 18-year-old American student studying in China with one of our friends doing Journey of the Universe has written, and we're about to post it on the Berry site, the most extraordinary description of the emergence of the universe that I have ever seen. 18 years old. It's stunning. So poetry is emerging. Peter Goldmark, who's a very significant figure in New York, head of the Herald Tribune, he's now in his 80s. He's done an amazing poem on the Journey of the Universe. So it's coming from people of older and younger and middle generation. Poetry, the arts, painting, really quite extraordinary. So that's why I want to end with this song that came to me just yesterday, actually, last night. I listened to it, and I was so enchanted by this young woman's song. And she said she wrote it, to be shared in the middle of the night when, as Drew tells us, we're thinking about what the future is. We're thinking about our children's children. So here's this lovely song, and we'll post it at some point. Let's hear her voice.
Calling us home, the land's wild music resounds in our heart. Over again, the soul cries to be set free. Knowing there's more, life is asking for participation. Eyes shining truth, we weave this tapestry. Come, take my hand, and guided by the voices of the land, we rewild again. Loving our home, we know Earth's body is the same as our own. The language of stars, our common ancestry. Tree, bird, animal, the flowing water. understanding. Our entire purpose is to give, nurturing all our relations. Oh, reprogramming, so our way of being is to live as just one thread of creation. Oh, come here to stand as men and women honoring the land. We rewild again. Come here to stand as men and women honoring the land. We rewild again. Come, take our hand and let yourself be nourished by the land. We rewild again.
Let's give it up for the next generation.